And joining us right now, live in studio, is the newly minted. I can almost smell the fresh paint in here. Look at that. The new chief of the Border Patrol, the Tucson sector, if you will, Roy Villarreal. Chief, it's good to have you in here.
Hey, thank you for having me in.
Welcome to the new job, I should say. Boy, did you walk into something else. This is a heck of a task down there, isn't it?
The Tucson sector is a monumental sector from the perspective of it is the largest sector along the southwest border, both from perspective of terrain that I'm responsible for and the level of manpower that I have. I've worked in 4 different sectors: San Diego, El Centro, Yuma, and now here in Tucson. And I also spent some time in headquarters in Washington, D.C., and a little bit of time down in Mexico City at the embassy.
What is the Tucson sector? From where to where? Give me a general geographical range for you.
So it's about 262 miles of international border with Mexico, from the Yuma County line to the New Mexico state line.
Yeah, the entire, basically, Arizona border, right?
Just about.
Just about. So one of the things, and I will admit that I hear, and I think we all do, we hear a lot of things about immigration, border, we hear about laws, policies, etc. But almost immediately I hear there's a legal I don't even know where we are with some of this stuff anymore. And I can only imagine it's slightly confusing for the Border Patrols to where are we today, what are we allowed to do, what are we not allowed to do. But I do have a question regarding the immigration crisis, the number of people attempting to claim asylum, and where are you, and what are the numbers looking like, and how have some of the new policies or rules changed what you're seeing along the southern border?
So it's a multifaceted question.
It is.
So bear with me there.
Fair enough.
But, when we look at what's going on, and I'll speak to 2 levels, both at the national perspective and then specifically to Tucson. On the national perspective, we've arrested over 800,000 illegal aliens. The last time we saw anything akin to this was in 2014 when we arrested about 479,000 people. So that's a stark difference. When I started the Border Patrol back in 1988, we were arresting about 1.5 million people per year. Mm-hmm. And then we began to gain control of the border, both in El Paso, San Diego, Arizona, and we saw a diminishment of the flow of illegal migration and narcotics because we gained control. And that flow of illegal aliens dropped down to about 300, maybe 350,000 people. So when you talk about a crisis, it's a crisis on multiple fronts. First and foremost, the volume of illegal aliens that we're encountering, but more importantly, it's about the demographics. The system that we have in place today was not designed for the demographics of the aliens that we're arresting: family units, unaccompanied children.
And previously, you were talking about. I don't want to put words in your mouth. You can agree, disagree. Previously, we were talking about young Mexican males coming here to work. It was primarily who was attempting to cross the border in many cases, and that's a different look now, different people showing up.
Absolutely. It was young Mexican males, single adults,
mm-hmm.
and the system was designed in such a manner that we would arrest someone, they would be processed, and they could be returned back to Mexico within 8 to 12 hours at the most. So we had a mechanism by which there was a relief valve in place.
Sure.
And when that demographic changed, Central Americans, unaccompanied children, that relief valve was removed.
And therein lies the problem we have.
We're speaking to Chief Border Patrol Agent Roy Villarreal, and you're talking about how things have changed. I'm wondering about our Border Patrol agents. We hear a lot about the people that are crossing the borders and need help. What about our agents? What are they facing now? What are their challenges that perhaps weren't there when there was only 400 and something thousand?
The challenges of today, so the traditional mission remains the same. And I'm very proud of the men and women of the Border Patrol. They do their job with enthusiasm. They do it professionally, and they rise to the occasion. And what I like to say, they rise to the threat. Because when you look at border security, we're talking about national security, and I don't want that to be lost in conversation. If we do not have a secure border, then there's the risk and the threat of narcotics. We have an opioid crisis ongoing right now. The risk of unchecked, unfettered illegal migration. And then there is that terrorism aspect. There are people out there that do want to cause harm and change our government. And that front line of defense is the Border Patrol. And when you ask about what's going on with agents in the field, they've risen to the crisis from the perspective that we're trained for border enforcement, and we go from a law enforcement mindset to search and rescue to social worker to today. Now we are providing care for this population again of families
and
like
children.
Children.
Yeah.
Children.
Yeah.
And when we talk about children, just in the last 2 weeks, There was a young girl, 7 years old, from Ecuador, who was pushed across the border by smugglers. A 7-year-old. And it's not uncommon to see an older sibling and a younger sibling. I've seen a 6-year-old with a 4-year-old traveling by themselves from El Salvador or Guatemala. So put that in perspective as a parent. Could you imagine your child at that young, tender age traveling thousands of miles by themselves? And when they reach the border, and this is something that I think is lost with the American public, it's not only these young children, but it's the family units. When they reach the border, there's a sense of relief because they get to the Border Patrol and they know that this arduous, dangerous journey is at an end. Mm-hmm. They know they'll be well cared for, they'll be fed, and in a number of cases they're provided with medical care. And so when you talk about the changes to the Border Patrol, it's that we've had to shift from strictly border enforcement and search and rescue to now everyday care for people. And it's difficult because we weren't trained for that.
Well, you weren't built for it from the start. Again, he is the chief of the Border Patrol here, the Tucson sector, Roy Villarreal. So you mentioned three things, and I'm curious if you could rank them for me. If you're looking at the threats, and I realize that you're working on, the job is to deal with all of them. Is the bigger issue drugs, narcotics coming across? Is it immigration, illegal immigration, or asylum seekers, or is it a concern over terrorism? How do you rank those, or how do you balance those?
You don't necessarily rank them because one leads to the other from this perspective. When we talked about the humanitarian crisis or the border crisis as a whole, at one point more than 60% of my workforce was dedicated to the care, the feeding, the hospital runs of family units and unaccompanied children, which means that there were whole segments of the border that were left unguarded because we had to shift our focus to caring for people. And then that chaos creates vulnerabilities, which are then exploited by the narcotic organizations, the trafficking organizations. So it's part and parcel. They go together. I don't want to say it's 1, 2, and 3 because one will impact the other or enable the other to prosper.
Makes sense. Is the issue an issue of manpower alone? Is this there just aren't enough people? Does the Border Patrol need to be more, it can expand when there's a need, contract maybe there isn't? I don't know if you ever believe in contracting, but is it just strictly a manpower issue right now? Is technology the answer to this?
It is a complex issue, and it's not solely manpower. We have about 19,000 agents in the entire United States Border Patrol. It sounds like a sizable number, but when you look at the fact that you're talking about the southwest border, the northern border, and our coastal borders,
we
forget
next
to nothing.
We forget Canada conveniently, and the fact that we have a border there. Yeah,
LAPD, New York PD, they are equivalent or larger than the United States Border Patrol. So that gives you a perspective of what we're contending with. It. You mentioned technology. We can certainly benefit from technology, but technology has its limitations also. In that, I've heard politicians advocate for additional technology, ground sensors or cameras. Those have limitations. Cameras have view sheds. There's areas, if you've lived or been along the southwest border, canyons, arroyos, all kind of places to hide. So technology is good, but it's got limitations. I think one of the bigger elements, manpower, technology, infrastructure, access to the border wall. But the biggest element at this point is getting Congress to do its job. We need a revamped immigration system. We need to shut down the loopholes. And thus far, Congress has sat on the sidelines.
Agreed.
And they've put the Border Patrol and our nation in a very vulnerable,
difficult position.
Thank you.
I'm going to help you with that.
Thank you.
It is a difficult position.
Well, they're too busy fighting themselves, it sounds like, quite honestly.
The issues become so politicized that there is no common ground, or there isn't a willingness to work together. At the height of the crisis, we had in detention 19,000 people, over 5,000 unaccompanied children. For us, crisis level is 6,000 people in detention. So when you look at that, that's threefold, and that was on a daily basis. We began approaching Congress, asking for assistance, in essence crying wolf months ago when we recognized that this threat was developing, and we recognized what that impact was going to be. And it became so politicized that first there was denial. They simply did not want
Stage 1 denial. Yeah,
they simply did not want to acknowledge that there was a crisis or a threat. And then we moved to the point that they acknowledged it, they accepted it, but then it became an issue of, is it about enforcement or humanitarian care? It wasn't until that Congress finally acknowledged that the fact that we needed humanitarian care, that they passed a multi-billion-dollar supplemental, which immediately had a beneficial impact to us. We went from 19,000 detainees to about 5,000 today. We went from 5,000 unaccompanied children to just under 200. That's Congress acting. That has an immediate impact on us. Now, the bigger issue, and I don't want people to think that that's been resolved. Bigger issue is that this is going to continue unless Congress shuts down these loopholes and looks at revamping our immigration system.
Is that the number one thing? If you had a magic wand, Chief Villarreal, what is that one thing that Congress could do that would make it? And I'm not just talking about easier for the Border Patrol, but actually help you do your job and do it properly.
So this is going to sound somewhat antithesis to what my job is, but
okay.
When you look at the number one thing that Congress can do for us, it's about taking action. Inaction in and of itself is action because it's put us in this precarious position. They need to take action. They need to revamp the immigration system. They need to shut down these loopholes. We need to get rid of the Flores settlement issue. Until that's done, this is going to continue. And thus far, the only entities that have stepped forward are foreign governments. The government of Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The government of Mexico has committed their federal police. They've created a new National Guard. There are 5,000 Mexican National Guards individuals on the northern border. There's 10,000 on the southern border. The federal police have set up checkpoints. And they have been deterring, detaining, and deporting people from Mexico. So when we talk about a crisis that's impacted us, think about the people that, had they not been detained or deterred in Mexico, we're at 800,000. We would have been easily well over 1 million. Guatemala and El Salvador have stepped up also.
So we're talking about the different roles that your agents have had to play over the years during this crisis, the number of people, the things Congress are and aren't doing. What about this one that now they want you to do, and that's the DNA collection from these detained immigrants? Do you think that that's even a possibility or reality, or is that just them overreaching again?
No, it's an absolute reality. And right now the focus with Congress is that we look strictly at family units that we suspect are fraudulent. And that happens with a high degree of frequency.
People using a child that is not theirs, knowing you will treat them differently as a family unit than they would have if they just came across by themselves.
Absolutely. What we've witnessed are people that are showing up, they've rented children.
Rented
that's just
children.
That's a horrible even thing, yeah.
It sounds callous, but that's the reality.
No,
they are
get
renting
it.
children. What we've seen is a fee of about $1,000 to $2,500 to rent a child, to present yourself as a family unit, recognizing that because of the loopholes in the system today that you're going to be released. And we've identified somewhere in the realm of about 3,000 children that have been recycled, rented, and used by different people.
So, keep coming back across the border with a different, quote, family.
Yes.
Wow.
So when you look at the DNA testing, right now that's the focus, and that is such a vulnerable population. And it scares the heck out of me to think about there's 3,000 kids that we identified, but they're not in our custody.
Right.
So they've been recycled through it. At what point are they?
Well, they're victims.
They are absolute victims.
They are victims in this.
At what point have they been trafficked? At what point are they returned to their parents? Where are they today? So that DNA testing will be very, very effective in identifying these fraudulent groups, and more importantly, I think saving these young children from the possibility of being trafficked, exploited, or whatever precarious situation they may find themselves in.
He is the new Tucson Sector Border Patrol Chief, and great to have you in here today, Chief Villarreal, and hear more from the front lines of exactly what it is you're dealing with down there, and hopefully, again, Congress listening as in what they can do along our southern border. We appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.